นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ So this evening I've been invited to give a Dhamma talk, and I'd like to consider it more like a reflection rather than sometimes they call it a sermon, but it's not really that, because I invite you to really observe, how what I say, how it affects you, so that you're not just thinking or being just a listener to me, but also being aware of how what I say, the sound of my voice or whatever, how it affects you emotionally. So this is a way of an attitude that I try to encourage in people, an attitude that I found most beneficial in my life, because we're so attached to the thinking mind and tend to analyze things and react to different words, tones of voice, various opinions, and then we agree or disagree with them accordingly, or we get confused, or whatever. So, in the kind of essence of Buddha's teaching is this word mindfulness. In the Pali, it's sati and sampatanya, the ability that we have as human beings to be aware of what's happening, to observe our own bodies and feelings and thoughts and reactions to the conditions we're experiencing in the present. Now this is a special day, memorial remembrance day of one of the great contemporary Buddhist monks in Thailand, Achaan Chah. And of course this was how he encouraged me when I encountered him nearly 44 years ago in Thailand. And his way of training us was to encourage us to really look and observe, our emotions, whatever they might be, positive, negative, confused, good, bad, right, wrong ones, and to be the observer or the knower, because as conscious entities, each one of us, a human individual that's conscious, is a conscious entity in this vast universe that is mysterious and rather formidable, because it seems so endless and vast, and where does the universe really end? There's so many possibilities of pleasure, pain, success and failure in our lifetimes, in terms of just planetary movements, changes, natural catastrophes, then the inevitable aging process of our human bodies. The fact that we are sensitive beings, we have to live in this state of unrelenting, unmitigated sensitivity from the time we're born to the time we die. And the realm we're living in is a sense realm, so planet Earth, its environment, the bodies we have, the senses that are, that that register the pleasurable, painful, the beautiful, the ugly, the desirable and undesirable qualities that inevitably impinge on us as individuals in our lifetime. It's kind of an ongoing experience of irritation. So this is just to set down a kind of reflective way of looking at the human condition. It is we are strange creatures in this vast universe. Are we all alone on planet Earth, or are there other human-like creatures on other planets? This is, of course, a mystery. We're always looking for, aliens from outer space, or wondering what is beyond, and beyond our system, our universal system. And of course, the imagination can only take you so far when you have to give up, because it is endless, it's infinite. And from this position of this rather delicate and vulnerable human form that we have, we can't know that much. And so the Buddha, in his compassion, established a teaching in a way that we can learn ultimate reality, recognize, and free ourselves from delusion through observing, through witnessing, through being mindful of our condition as we're living our life within the limitations that we find ourselves as human individuals. Now, modern civilization, modern culture is based on the idea of progress and material development and evolution, and so that modern science, as it tends to be taught in most places, is based very much on empirical, of looking outward, trying to figure out everything external. Or, we've developed telescopes to look at things far away, or microscopes to look at minutiae of things we can't see with our own eyes. But it's always the tendency to look away, to go outward into the universe, into the material world that we're experiencing. And the Buddha, of course, establishing his his teaching on mindfulness. Now this word, English word, is not really all that good a word actually, but it'll do as a kind of translation of Sati Sampajanya. But its ability to reach the very center of pure consciousness before we create anything into it. If we are truly mindful and cultivate and develop mindfulness in our lives, then we're actually going to the very center, to pure conscious awareness before we become a personality or anything at all. And so this is, and of course the Buddha means, the actual word Buddha means awakened consciousness. So the historical Buddha, Gautama the Buddha, was a human individual in the universe, the same as you and I, no difference. But he, in his lifetime, was able to relinquish the cultural delusions, the conditioning of his mind, in order to recognize pure, unadulterated consciousness with awareness. And from this, of course, wisdom manifests, ability to discern and realize Dhamma, the reality of Dhamma. So this word Dhamma is a very significant word, and and to translate it, it doesn't have a really proper equivalent in English. So we take the word itself into the English context because it includes everything and no thing. it's beyond, you have the conditions and then the unconditioned. You have the sankharas and the grasping of sankharas, but there's also awareness of sankharas. Like sankharas are conditions, things that arise and cease, can be observed, whether it's mental, emotional, physical, through sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or thought. All conditions are impermanent. So this is the way of investigating and observing the nature of all conditions, and that which is aware of conditions. That awareness takes us to what they call amatta Dhamma, awakened, conscious awakening to reality. And so this word amatta means a deathless reality, amatta Dhamma. It's a very clear and I think very brilliant formulation in language, the Buddha's teaching as we encountered in the Pali scriptures, in the suttas. I've used mainly in my monastic life just the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Four Noble Truths. Because I found this is what I would consider a perfect teaching. It has everything in it you need to know. It's just a matter of putting it into practice, because it's not for grasping as some kind of Buddhist doctrine, but it's a tool the Buddha gave us to use to let go and free ourselves from delusions. Now, like all of us, when we're born, when a baby is born, it's a separate, it begins its life as a separate human form that's conscious. And so it has the human karma, the body that was born and that will die, and it's a conscious form. And it has the karma of the human condition. It has, instinctual intelligence, survival mechanisms, and so forth. But then as we grow up, as we develop, we're conditioned through our cultural conditioning, social conditioning, the messages, the attitudes, the language we acquire from our family, the values of our particular family, our social status, our religion, whatever it might be. And this is the conditioning process that tends to blind us to ultimate truth, to Dhamma, because the conditioning process tends to be what we cling to. As we grow up, we develop a strong sense of our separateness, our individuality, personality, identity with our human form, what we look like, gender of the body, its color of the skin, size of the nose, and all this become what we identify with, and then we compare it with other models. So we have this sense of, trying to see ourselves in comparison through comparing our appearance with somebody else's, or some ideal of physical beauty, an ideal form. We also have the ability to create ideals in our minds, of how things should be, the best. With words, with language, we can imagine the best of the conditioned realm, how everything should be. And then we tend to compare everything with the ideals that we have created, or that we have taken on from our cultural conditioning. So when we grow up, then we start suffering, because we're basically bound to illusions, just conditions created by unenlightened human beings, and those conditions, of course, have different qualities of good, bad, right, wrong, true and false. But whatever they are, they're never satisfying. Conditioned phenomena can never. It always leaves us in a state of dissatisfaction, disappointment, or feeling we're missing something. Something is lacking in our lives. And this, the reason why we try to have wealth and security, but even at life at its very best, with all the possible wealth, security, social position, the problem is still there. Because the problem itself is the blind conditioning, attachment to the conditions that human beings tend to be obstructed with, blinded by. And therefore that's why we have always conflicts, wars, problems, personal relationships, and it's ad infinitum, the variations and problems that arise on the conditioned level. For all of us, whatever culture, society, or whatever you're in, we all have our own forms of feeling dissatisfied, or ill at ease, or anxious about the future. We regard time as our reality. So time is what we truly believe is real, and yet time is another condition. We consider our lives in terms of the length and the age of the physical bodies we have, and its appearance, and then its conditioning, and then of course it grows up and gets old. It suffers the aging process, various illnesses, and then it dies. And so there's always this sense of pathos. Life on the human realm is always associated with a kind of sadness, because our life it always ends in death. And in the monastic life, we always, every day in a Buddhist monastery, we reflect on this reflection. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. And of course some people might consider this rather a depressing thing to think about, but it is the way it is. It's pointing to what every human individual has to bear with at the end of their lives, as separation and loss. And so the Buddhist meditation is a way of awakening to the real, to the ultimate reality, to Dhamma, to truth, before we die. So Luang Por one of his phrases was, "Die before you die." And so this could, and of course if you try to interpret that from a mind that is not very reflective, it doesn't make much sense. But in terms of Dhamma reflection, the death is always the changing conditions. We're dying all the time, really, in various ways, and seeking rebirth through our just being blind and wanting things and not wanting things. But we don't notice it. We strongly associate ourselves with the age of our physical body. So during this time between birth and death is this possibility for enlightenment, for seeing clearly the Dhamma, or the truth. Or I like to put it in English was awake to the real. Because in like in England, for example, sometimes we look like Buddhist monks. We look like to the English layman, like so you're not living in the real world, because we live in a monastery, and it's not the same world that most people have, to bear with in their busy lives in London and so forth. So they say you don't have to face the real world. So this is, I thought, what is the real world then? And are they living in the real world, or what do we mean? You know, so the real world for most people is their lives, their how much money they make, their families, their social position, paying off their debts, their mortgages, and buying a new car and so forth. The real world, or is the real world not any of that, but this awareness, awaken not to a world but to reality. And so reality then is seen in terms of discerning the difference between conditions and the unconditioned. Be able to observe and discern, which is not an analytical ability, but an intuitive sense of attentiveness, and which you're letting go of the conditioning that you've acquired in order to observe conditioning as it really is, as impermanent, as anicca, as anatta. You begin to see that whatever you think you are, good or bad, right or wrong, that's not what you are. And so that this is to be observed, that what we are, we don't need to know what we really are, just what we are not. And so in Buddhist meditation, like especially in the insight practices of vipassana, these are skillful means in the scriptural teachings to see, to observe the way things are in order to let go of our blind attachments to birth and death, or conditioned phenomena that is in this process of change from arising, ceasing, beginning and ending. So I spent 10 years in Thailand and tried to live as close to Achaan Chah as I could, because he'd send me off sometimes to various branch monasteries, because he was obviously a very wise human being. And right from the start, when I first met him, I was quite impressed. And even though we did have, we didn't have a common language to converse with, there's something, you should call it intuition or a sense beyond the sense, something in one kind of recognizes something that at the time maybe I didn't quite know what I was recognizing, but a kind of felt sense that this is someone to trust, someone who I would like to live near. So I spent 10 years, either in his monastery or at various branches. And then he had me sent over abroad after 10 years off to England. It's always been a kind of, a kind of inspiration to see, to meet an enlightened being, or meet a wise human being in one's life. And because I'd never really, I remember when I was entering university, I entered university in 1951. I just turned 17 years old, very naive. And I had such admiration for all the lecturers, professors, and people that had all this learning. And so, I was, hoping to acquire some kind of wisdom and knowledge through being a university student, through these supposedly superior creatures. And of course, didn't take too long to see that wisdom was not really part of the university system that I encountered. And, people might have acquired a lot of knowledge about various subjects in science, arts, history, language, and so forth, but it was an acquired knowledge, something you got from outside yourself, from reading books, from listening to others. So then my interest in meditation began when I, kind of lost interest in that kind of learning and realized that one needed to learn in a different way. And of course, the teaching of the Buddha isn't about acquiring all kinds of knowledge about Buddhism, but in actually letting go, seeing the result of attaching to knowledge that you acquire, opinions that you've acquired or created in your mind, or your own cultural conditioning, blindly assuming and operating from the very biases, prejudices, attitudes of the conditioning process, and the ego, the sense of a self as a separate entity in relationship to everything else. So in Ajahn Chah's emphasis on sati sampajanya was something I really appreciated, because he could bring the actual monastic form, the structure of Vinaya and the form into consciousness to be used, not to just institutionalize us and make us into kind of conventional monks, just like changing costumes, but to actually use conventions for observing, witnessing, reflecting on the experiences that an individual has, living within a monastery, within a disciplined structure, a committed way of surrendering to a moral convention, a system of etiquette and a tradition, and learning to use that experience not for attachment, but for helping. I could see it to help myself to see more clearly, to trust in this awareness and observe within the boundaries and structures of monastic form. And so this was, I think, Luang Por Chah's genius. It made sense out of both the Dhamma, Vinaya, and he offered excellent opportunities to develop and cultivate monastic life. So it was through his wisdom and his compassion that I'm still a monk, really, because he was. I began to appreciate, the whole package of this tradition, in the Theravadas tradition, as I learned it through living and training with Luang Por Chah in his monastery in Thailand. Wisdom is, when we use this word, one was expecting, when I was naive and a new university student, I was expecting to find wisdom in a university, and taking courses in philosophy, and we learned all kind of wise sayings and studied the wisdom of others. And so we could maybe be very clever with our ways of thinking and manipulating our thoughts and intellect to come up with new ideas, new ways of analysis, or just maneuvering through the conditioned realm of thought. But the thinking process itself is an obstruction if grasped as an end in itself. And this the Buddha pointed to in his teaching of letting go of conditioned phenomena. Because, the thinking process is conditioned. Our ability to think in the language. We have, my original language is English, of course, so I mean it's what I think in is this language. And then the thinking process, it depends on memory, and then it's also influenced by the culture, by the attitude, like the American English and attitudes of Americans can be quite different from the English. So even the language, there is a statement about the thing that separates the British from the Americans is their common language. But language itself is not to be, when we just grasp concepts, no matter how sublime those concepts might be, or even in terms of worldly values wise, the ignorance is still there. The unawakened state of just operating from the conditioned plane without any reference, without any discernment, but just through conditioning. Language also, and the thinking process, is very dualistic. It has, if you have good, you have to have bad and right, then there's wrong, true, and then false, heaven and hell. And so on the level of trying to figure out things like Buddha used words that have no, that you can't imagine what they are, like the concept nibbana. This word is, what is it, and you're trying to imagine. And nowadays, the word nibbana means the best, usually. You see, in all, like I've been in Australia, New Zealand, things like the Nirvana Beauty Salon or something like this. So, and so it usually is associated with bliss, happiness, or the very best, or a kind of heavenly state. But what the Buddha, you see, the emphasis the Buddha made was not on this dualistic structure of nibbana as opposed, to have some opposite, but to realize nibbana is mean letting go of thoughts, of language, of our conditioned way of thinking through the cultural conditioning, to realize the ultimate reality, the deathless, the amatta Dhamma, the real. And that we can't, when you try to describe that or define it or analyze it, you just get your, brain in a twist. It just is impossible because it's beyond imagination. The Buddha used words like anatta and nibbana and shunyata. He used words like the unborn, uncreated, unformed, unconditioned. He used like the amatta Dhamma, deathless truth, deathless reality. And these words, they are, words, translation of Pali words into English words, but notice that the conditioned and the unconditioned, just taking these two words, the unconditioned is just a negation of conditions, but it has tried to imagine, tried to create an image of the unconditioned in your mind, and you can't do it. Your thinking process packs up. But it can create any condition, whether it's a fantasy or just a memory of, something like a chair or a table. But the conditioned realm has form, has color, has taste. It can, and then we can create conditions. We can create fantasies in our mind and manipulate conditions with ideas, images, true, false, right, wrong images, beautiful, ugly, whatever. But the unconditioned, unborn, we can't. And so the Buddha in his teaching was bringing us to the point where we see the futility and the suffering we create by our obsessive, blind attachment to conditions. And of course, modern society now is very much attached to the thinking process, to reason, logic, to try to analyze, criticize, to compare, beliefs in progress and how attachment to ideals, strong views, strong opinions about politics, economics, religion, philosophy, whatever. So these attachments, even if we're attaching to something very good, it still has its opposite, and it still binds us to the confusion that we create through this blind attachment. So the aim, it's been, in my lifetime, I became interested in Buddhism in 1955, when I was in the American Navy in Japan, came across Zen Buddhism. And so that was 1955 up to the present. I've seen, in 1955 there were hardly anybody had any interest, in terms of people I knew, other Americans, who had any interest whatsoever in Buddhism. It was not, something that was a part of our cultural expectation. It came to, a kind of fashionable, faddish interest in the 1950s, through the American occupation of Japan, cultural exchanges that were taking place. And from that, of course, it was the beginning, over 50 years, the kind of amount of interest that countries like the United States or the United Kingdom and European countries and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all these places, and even, in countries that you wouldn't expect any interest at all in Buddhism. There we get emails and seeking information or invitations to give retreats. And why is it that at this time there's this sudden interest, an upsurge of interest in Buddhadharma? Because in terms of, say, Western attitudes about progress and evolution, Buddhism is a very old tradition. It's like, it's older than most other religions. And so it's, 2,552 years for us is a long, long time. And it can also be seen as something appropriate to ancient India. And what is it, why is it that, was there any interest in modern Malaya or in modern Britain, for example? And it's because it's a wisdom teaching that has survived through the various rising, falling civilizations that it's inevitably encountered in its past history and survived up to the present time. And it is not about ancient Indian religion or culture. The whole emphasis the Buddha made was on the common human experience that we can all relate to, is suffering. And so in this unique way of teaching, he brought attention to suffering, or in Pali, dukkha. It means this sense of dissatisfaction or a lack, or when even life at its best, there's still this dukkha, this suffering that we experience. as human individuals, whether, whatever, if we're wealthy or poor, male or female, European, Asian, or whatever, it's the suffering is very much the same thing. And this using suffering or dukkha as a noble truth is a very, unique approach to religious and spiritual practice. And because it's not ultimate truth, it's not like the ultimate reality. It would be a very depressing kind of religion if we all just assumed everything's suffering and unsatisfactory in a kind of resigned way to misery. But it's putting suffering into consciousness so that we begin to observe it and be able to discern that which is aware of suffering isn't suffering. So it's a very direct way of pointing to reality always in the present, the timeless reality of now. And this of course, is now a teaching sought after in the Western world in a way that it was never even considered, or way most Western people, Europeans, Americans, could never really understand or appreciate such an approach until fairly recently. It was too bizarre, too different from our own to even be able to understand it, even on the intellectual level. Very few could really appreciate it until fairly recently. Now, over the past 50 years, there are so many Western people have practiced Buddhist meditation, taken on in various Buddhist traditions, that there are now quite, teachers, of European teachers who have insight and have knowledge that from the practice of Buddhism, where, say, 50 years ago there wasn't anyone that I encountered. And then when I went to Thailand in 1966, went there in order to find a teacher, because I certainly couldn't find any where I was living in the United States. So it wasn't through lack of trying. Didn't seem to be any there, or if they were, I didn't know where they were. So the aim of going to Asia was to search for a teacher that would teach me how to practice meditation. And so that is why I, went to Thailand and became a Buddhist monk, and why I still am one, because obviously it was an effective teaching. And then the life of a Buddhist monk I quite enjoy. And it's not it's a very good way to live one's life as a human individual. And something totally out of my expectation from my social, cultural background. I never ever thought my parents would have never have expected their son to be a Buddhist monk. But that's what's happened, and of course the result of this is a sense of gratitude to the Buddha, the traditional, the historical Buddha, and all the monastic Sangha that has supported this teaching through the centuries up to the present time, where I could encounter it and practice it. And of course that is exemplified in the figure of Luang Por as the teacher that I encountered, that I found, that I felt a great affinity with, and could really trust and consider his way of living, his own behavior, and the way he taught us. So this is a time now it's very heartwarming to see here in Malaya the amount of interest now, because when I first came to Malaysia in 1964, there wasn't anything like this happening. And so I feel very inspired by this brief visit to Malaya this time, here in Kuala Lumpur and in Penang for 2 nights, and to see the growing interest in this wisdom teaching, because it is something that is that I've found that I can wholeheartedly recommend. That it is an effective tool to use for freeing oneself from ignorance and the suffering that we create in our minds. So I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation for all those involved, to Sienma and all the people who joined in making this day possible, because it is the day in Thailand that is the Memorial Remembrance Day in Ubon at the monastery, Luang Por Monastery, and the Sangha tends to collect there on the 16th of January every year, and I usually try to attend the meeting there every year, going from England to Thailand intentionally to attend this Memorial Day, Remembrance Day. And in Wat Pah Pong, it's usually a week before the 16th of January. It starts with a kind of retreat, meditations, and as the people assemble and Luang Por Chah's disciples gather. And it's something that always, something I feel is worthy to do, because to have this sense of gratitude for a teacher is a very, it brings joy into one's own mind. And the monastic life itself leads to, if lived properly, leads towards gratitude and contentment. And nowadays, contentment is a virtue that hardly anyone recognizes, because the society is determined to keep us totally discontented. And so the economy will develop. If you all contented, the economy as we know it would collapse. So we have to be discontented and always want something, the newest thing, the newest model, the latest design. And so modern materialism, free market capitalism and so forth is designed to make us want things and be discontented. And the monastic life, as the Buddha established it in this traditional form, is leading towards contentment with very few things. And so contentment is also a very peaceful mental experience. To be content is a tranquil experience. Contentment, gratitude, these are the foundations of the holy life, of spiritual development. Just trying to through your own willpower, attain nibbana, it's impossible. No matter how clever you might be, it's through letting go and through these simple reflections to bring contentment and gratitude and peacefulness. And the true nature of our consciousness is that, in which we begin to not struggle anymore in the kind of mindless way that one used to struggle, because that's all one had done in one's life was to keep struggling to compete and develop and get something you don't have yet, or get rid of the things that you have you don't like. So now I will end this reflection and my gratitude, appreciation for all the care and attention and hard work that went into making this event possible. I have Ajahn Dhamma come from Thailand, and Ajahn Chandiko came all the way from New Zealand, Ajahn Chah from Germany, and all assembled here, and other monks from many other places here in Kuala Lumpur on the 16th of January 2010. So I wish to give you all my best wishes and blessings, and encourage your interest and practice of the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.